welcome back. Before we begin, I want you to think about something for a moment. Think about the people closest to you, the ones who sit at your table, who know your habits, who call you by name. Now ask yourself, honestly, how well do you really know them? Because in Highgate in the winter of 1952, a dying old man thought he knew exactly who to trust. He was wrong. Sir Aldous Vane was found slumped over his desk on a Tuesday evening, his pen still uncapped, a freshly signed will lying beneath his cold hand. The doctor called it heart failure. The family called it tragedy. And for 3 quiet days, everyone believed them. Everyone except one man, a small man, fastidiously dressed, with a perfectly waxed mustache and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Not a crooked picture frame, not a misplaced word, not a signature that was ever so slightly wrong. Hercule Poirot had seen greed wear many disguises in his long career. But this one, dressed in black, weeping into a handkerchief at a dead man's funeral, this one was perhaps the coldest he had ever encountered. Stay with us. The house that time forgot the fog came early to Highgate that November. It rolled in from the heath sometime before 4 in the afternoon, swallowing the iron lampposts whole, softening the edges of garden walls, turning the long residential street into something that belonged more to memory than to the present. By the time Hercule Poirot stepped out of the black taxicab at the corner of Vane Lane, he could barely make out the gates of the house at the far end. 2 tall pillars of dark stone with a rusted iron arch between them, the words Vane House worked into the metalwork in letters that had once been proud and were now simply old. He stood for a moment on the pavement, his coat collar turned up, his gloved hands clasped before him. The taxicab pulled away behind him. Poirot did not move immediately. He rarely did. He had learned long ago that the first impression of a place, before the mind began to organize and categorize, was often the most honest one. And his first impression of Vane House was this. It did not want visitors. The house itself was Victorian, 4 stories of dark London brick, with tall, narrow windows that reflected nothing. A short gravel path led from the gate to the front door, flanked on either side by overgrown box hedges that had been left to grow as they pleased for what looked like several seasons. One of the upper shutters hung slightly open, at an angle that suggested it had been that way for some time, and nobody had thought to fix it. Or perhaps nobody had been allowed to. Poirot retrieved the letter from his coat pocket and read it once more, though he had already memorized its contents. Dear Monsieur Poirot, I write to you in some distress and with little time for pleasantries. My employer, Sir Aldous Vane, is not a well man. He has, in recent weeks, made certain decisions regarding his estate which have caused considerable agitation among his family. I do not wish to say more in a letter. I ask only that you come. I believe something is very wrong in this house. Yours in desperation, Dora Fitch, housekeeper, Vane House, Highgate. The letter was dated 4 days ago. He had not responded immediately. There had been a prior engagement in the city, a consultation that could not be postponed in, and he felt now, standing at the gate in the thickening fog, a faint and unfamiliar unease. He was not accustomed to arriving late to things. Punctuality was, in his view, a form of respect. For others, yes, but also for events themselves. Events had a way of not waiting. He pushed open the gate. It gave a long, low groan. The housekeeper met him at the door before he had even raised his hand to the bell. She was a stout woman in her mid-50s, dressed entirely in gray, with the kind of face that had once been cheerful and had since learned better. Her eyes were red at the rims. She had been crying, he noted, and not recently. Not the fresh tears of shock, but the slow, exhausted weeping of someone who had been frightened for a long time. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, and the relief in her voice was almost painful to hear. "Madame Fitch." He stepped inside. "I am sorry I did not come sooner." She closed the door behind him and the fog disappeared, replaced by the interior smell of Vane House. Camphor and old wood, and something beneath both of those. Something faintly chemical that Poirot could not immediately identify and filed away without comment. The entrance hall was large and dim, lit by a single electrical fixture that had been installed at some point in the last decade without any particular enthusiasm. The wallpaper was dark green, a William Morris pattern that might once have been fashionable and was now simply oppressive. A wide staircase rose at the far end, its banister a deep mahogany. On the walls hung a series of oil portraits, Vane ancestors, presumably, each one regarding the hall below with expressions of varying degrees of disapproval. "He's upstairs," Mrs. Fitch said. "In the study. He won't come down much anymore. Not since September. He is unwell. Dr. Crane says it's his heart. Has been for 2 years now." She lowered her voice, though there was no one else in the hall. "But he was well enough last week, monsieur. Well enough to call Mr. Soames, that's his solicitor, and have him come round with papers. A new will, they said, signed and witnessed on Thursday afternoon." She paused. "He was dead by Thursday evening." Poirot was still. "I see. The family says it was the excitement, the effort of it all, the signing, having people in the house." Dr. Crane agreed. "Wrote it up as heart failure, natural causes, no reason for any fuss." She folded her hands together in front of her, tightly, the knuckles whitening. "But I've worked in this house for 22 years, Monsieur Poirot. I knew Sir Aldous better than anyone alive. And I'll tell you this. He did not look like a man who was simply tired on Thursday morning. He looked like a man who was afraid. Sir Aldous Vane had been, by all accounts, a man of extraordinary contradictions. He had inherited considerable wealth from his father, shipping primarily, with interests in several colonial trade routes that had made the family rich in the previous century, and merely comfortable in this one. He had never married. He had never, so far as anyone could determine, been particularly close to another human being. He had lived in Vane House for 40 years, emerging occasionally for business, less occasionally for society, and in the last decade, scarcely at all. His relatives, a niece and a nephew, both children of his deceased brother Edmund, had maintained dutiful contact. They visited at Christmas, telephoned on birthdays, sent flowers when he was ill. Whether this attention was affectionate or strategic was a question Poirot had already begun to consider. Mrs. Fitch led him now through the ground floor, past a sitting room draped in dust sheets, past a dining room with a table that seated 12, and had perhaps not done so in many years, and into the small rear parlor where she had evidently been sitting when he arrived. A fire burned there. A cup of tea sat cooling on the side table. "The family arrived this morning," she said, settling into her chair with the air of someone who needed to sit down badly. "Miss Cecily came first. She's been here since 10. Mr. Roland arrived just after noon. And Mr. Soames, the solicitor, came round at 2, though I'm not sure what for, since he'd already done his business Thursday. They are here now? In the house?" "Upstairs, mostly. Mr. Roland went straight to the study, Sir Aldous's study, and spent an hour in there with the door shut. I didn't like it. I told him the room ought to be left as it was, but he said he was looking for certain documents relating to the estate." She said the word documents with a particular flatness that communicated precisely what she thought of that explanation. Poirot nodded slowly. "And Miss Cecily?" "In the drawing room. On the telephone, when I last checked. She's been on it most of the afternoon, Mrs. Fitch hesitated. She was crying earlier, real tears, mind you. I'm not saying she wasn't upset. But she dried them very quickly when she thought someone was coming. Tears that dry quickly, Poirot murmured, are not always false. But they are always interesting. He moved to the parlor window and looked out at the grey garden beyond. A rectangle of dead lawn, a bare oak, a stone bench no one had sat on in years. The fog pressed at the glass. Madame Fitch, he said without turning round. The new will, the one signed Thursday, do you know its contents? Not exactly, no. But I know this much, Mr. Roland came to me 2 months ago, very casual, very pleasant about it, and asked me whether I knew if Sir Aldous had ever discussed changing his will. I told him I didn't involve myself in such matters. A short pause. He didn't believe me, I could tell. And had Sir Aldous discussed it? With you? A long silence. The fire crackled. He told me, 6 weeks ago, that he intended to leave the house to a charitable trust, she said quietly. He said Roland and Cecily had enough from their own father's estate and didn't need his money on top of it. He seemed very decided about it. She looked up at Poirot. The new will, monsieur. Mr. Soames let slip that it leaves everything to Mr. Roland, everything. The house, the investments, all of it. Poirot turned from the window. That, he said softly, is very interesting indeed. He did not say what he was thinking, not yet. But his eyes had gone to the faint chemical smell he had noticed upon entering the house, and his mind had gone to the small bottle of heart medication he had noticed on the hallway table near the stairs, and to the name printed on the prescription label, Dr. P. Crane, Digitalis Preparation, as directed. He picked up his hat from the chair where he had set it, smoothed the brim once with his thumb, and said to Mrs. Fitch very calmly, I think perhaps I should like to see the study the relatives gather. The study of Sir Aldous Vane was on the first floor, at the end of a narrow corridor that ran the length of the house like a spine. Mrs. Fitch led Poirot up the main staircase, and along the passage, her footsteps hushed on the faded carpet runner, a deep burgundy that had once been rich and was now the color of dried roses. The corridor was lined on one side with more portraits, more vain ancestors, more expressions of ancestral disapproval. On the other side, 3 doors, all closed. From behind the second one, Poirot could hear the low murmur of a voice, a woman's voice, unhurried, almost languid, still on the telephone. The study door was at the very end. Mrs. Fitch stopped before it and put her hand on the knob, then paused. Mr. Roland was in here for an hour this afternoon, she said again, as if she wanted Poirot to understand this was not merely inconvenient but wrong. And nothing was said to him. No one asked him to leave? I'm the housekeeper, monsieur, and he is the heir. The word came out with a particular bitterness, barely concealed. Or so he believes himself to be. She opened the door. The study was a large, square room, and it smelled, more strongly here than anywhere else in the house, of that same faint chemical undertone Poirot had noticed below. Beneath it was pipe tobacco, old paper, and the particular dry dustiness of a room where the windows had not been opened for weeks. The desk dominated the center of the room. It was a massive thing, Victorian oak, with a leather writing surface the color of old port. A brass lamp stood at one corner, unlit. A blotter lay at the center, and it was here that Sir Aldous Vane had been found, his body slumped forward, his cheek against the leather, his right hand still loosely curled around a fountain pen. The body had been removed, of course. The pen had not. Poirot stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the room without entering it. This was another of his habits, the initial survey from the threshold, before the feet disturbed anything, before proximity narrowed the view. The desk, the chair behind it, pushed back at an angle. A small side table to the left bearing a crystal decanter of brandy and 2 glasses, one used and washed, one unused. A bookcase along the far wall, legal volumes primarily, and a row of account ledgers. A cold fireplace, a single armchair near the window, and on the corner of the desk, held down by a small paperweight of green glass, a document, several pages folded once. Even from the doorway, Poirot could see the formal typography of a legal instrument, and at the bottom of the visible page, a signature. He crossed the room and stood over it without touching it. Aldous R. Vane. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he straightened, clasped his hands behind his back, and began to move slowly around the room. "Has anything been removed?" he asked. "Since Thursday evening?" "Not by me," Mrs. Fitch said from the doorway. "I can't speak for Mr."
Roland. They found Roland Vane in the drawing room on the ground floor. A room that had been unsheeted, Poirot noticed, since his arrival, as if someone had decided the house should begin.
Presenting a more inhabited face. Roland was standing at the mantelpiece when they entered, one arm resting along its shelf, a glass of the dead man's brandy in his other hand. He was perhaps 45, lean and dark-haired with a face that was handsome in a precise architectural way. The kind of face that photographed well and revealed very little. He was dressed correctly for mourning, dark suit, black tie. His eyes, when he turned, were dry. "Ah," he said, "the detective." It was not said rudely, exactly, but it was said in the tone of a man who had already decided what category Poirot belonged to, and found that category mildly inconvenient.
"Monsieur Van."
Poirot inclined his head. "I offer my condolences on the loss of your uncle. Thank you." Roland set his glass down on the mantelpiece. "I wasn't aware Mrs. Fitch had engaged outside assistance. I'm not sure it's entirely necessary. My uncle died of a heart condition he'd had for 2 years. Dr. Crane has been perfectly clear on the matter." "No doubt," said Poirot pleasantly. "And yet here I am. You will forgive an old man his curiosity." Roland looked at him for a moment, the slightly too long look of a man recalibrating, and then something in his posture eased, almost imperceptibly. He had decided, Poirot noted, that Poirot was not a serious threat. This was, in Poirot's experience, always a useful thing for people to decide. "Of course," Roland said. "Ask whatever you like. We've nothing to hide. You were in your uncle's study this afternoon. May I ask what you were looking for?" A brief pause. "Not long enough to be suspicious, almost. Estate documents. Insurance papers. There's a great deal of administration involved when someone dies, Monsieur Poirot. I imagine you know that." "I was trying to get a sense of the filing system before Soames comes back tomorrow." "And did you find what you were looking for?" "Most of it, yes." "Most," Poirot repeated, as if tasting the word. Then he smiled. "Of course. These things are never entirely straightforward." Cecily Vane came downstairs 20 minutes later, and she entered the room in the manner of someone who had taken considerable care to appear as, though she had taken no care at all. She was 38, perhaps, younger than her brother by several years, and where Roland was precise and contained, Cecily was all warmth and movement. Dark hair, loosely pinned, a black dress that was slightly too elegant for the occasion, or perhaps exactly elegant enough, depending on one's perspective. Her eyes were large and very dark, and they moved quickly around the room when she entered, taking in Mrs. Fitch, taking in her brother, and then settling on Poirot with an expression of undisguised curiosity. "You must be the man Dora wrote to," she said, not unkindly. "Hercule Poirot." "The very same, mademoiselle. I read about you once in a magazine article." She sat down in the armchair by the window, with the ease of someone entirely comfortable occupying space. Something about a case in the south of France. A poisoning, if I remember correctly. Your memory is excellent, she smiled, a quick, genuine-seeming smile. Uncle Aldous used to say that I had a memory like a trap and a tongue to match. He meant it as a criticism, I think. I always took it as a compliment. The smile faded, not dramatically, but naturally, the way smiles do when a real feeling moves beneath them. I'm going to miss him. He was a difficult man, but he was ours, you know. Poirot watched her carefully. The grief was real, he thought. And then, because he had been doing this for a very long time, he added the silent qualification, real, and also not the whole story. Roland, still at the mantelpiece, turned his glass slowly in his hand and said nothing. Mr. Leonard Soames arrived at 5:30, uninvited. Poirot heard the bell, heard Mrs. Fitch's footsteps in the hall, heard the low exchange at the door. When the solicitor was shown into the drawing-room, Poirot had already formed a preliminary impression from the footsteps alone. Quick, deliberate, a man who moved as though he were perpetually slightly late for something. Soames was 60, small and neat, with silver hair and the careful, considered manner of a man who had spent 4 decades being paid to say the right thing. He carried a leather briefcase that he did not set down. His eyes went to Roland first, then to Cecily, then to Poirot, and on Poirot they stayed a fraction of a second longer than was entirely natural. "I didn't realize there would be company," he said. "Monsieur Poirot is here at my invitation," Mrs. Fitch said from the doorway, with a dignity that surprised even Poirot slightly. "Ah!" Soames turned to Roland. "I came about the will. There are certain procedural matters. Given the speed of Sir Aldous passing after the signing, the probate office may require additional documentation. A formality, nothing more." "Of course," Roland said smoothly. "Sit down, Leonard. Have a drink." "I won't, thank you." But he did sit. He set the briefcase on his knees and folded his hands on top of it. His knuckles, Poirot noticed, were very slightly white. "Monsieur Soames," Poirot said, in the easy conversational tone he used when he was being most precise, "you were called by Sir Aldous on Thursday morning, yes? To come and witness the will?" "That's correct." "At what time did he telephone you?" "Just after 11, I believe. And you arrived at 12:30, perhaps 1:45. A reasonable journey from your offices in the city." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "And the signing itself, how did Sir Aldous seem to you?" "In his manner, his general condition." Soames considered this with the care of a man choosing his words from a very limited supply. "He was tired, weaker than I had seen him, but perfectly lucid, perfectly capable of understanding what he was signing." "You are certain of this?" "Absolutely certain." "Good," said Poirot. "That is very good." He paused. "And the signature itself? Did you observe him sign?" "I was in the room, yes." "That is not quite what I asked," Poirot said gently. A silence settled over the drawing-room. The fire ticked. Outside, the fog had gone entirely dark. Soames opened his mouth, closed it. "I was present throughout." Poirot smiled. "Of course you were," he said. "Of course." But his eyes in that moment were not on Soames at all. They were on Roland Vane, who had turned very slightly away from the room, and whose hand, wrapped around the brandy glass, had, for just a fraction of a second, tightened. The ink was still wet. The morning after Poirot's arrival, Vane House did not look any less forbidding in daylight. If anything, it looked worse. The November sun, what little there was of it, arrived thin and watery at 8:30, doing nothing for the dark brick and everything for the shadows. Poirot stood at his bedroom window on the second floor, and looked down at the garden below, where the dead lawn glistened with frost, and the stone bench wore a thin white crust along its top. He had slept badly, not from worry exactly, but from thinking, which, for Poirot, was rarely a restful activity. He had lain awake in the narrow guest bed, the old house settling and creaking around him, and turned the facts over in his mind the way a jeweler turns a stone beneath a loupe, slowly, methodically, looking for the angle at which the light changes. The facts, as he presently understood them, were these. Sir Aldous Vane, a man of 74 with a documented heart condition, had died on Thursday evening following an afternoon during which he had signed a new will. A will that departed dramatically from his previously stated intentions and left his entire estate to his nephew Roland. The death had been attributed to natural causes by the attending physician, a doctor, Philip Crane, who had been treating Sir Aldous for 2 years and who had prescribed digitalis, a heart medication, some months previously. The solicitor, Leonard Soames, had been present at the signing and had confirmed its validity. Roland and Cecily Vane had arrived the following morning. Mrs. Dora Fitch, the housekeeper, had written to Poirot 4 days ago in a state of considerable distress. These were the facts, and then there was the signature, Aldous R. Vane. Poirot had spent 20 minutes with the will the previous evening after the others had retired, standing at Sir Aldous's desk with a lamp held close, examining the signature with a small magnifying glass he carried always in his inside breast pocket. He had then spent another 10 minutes going through the documents in the top desk drawer. Letters, receipts, a handwritten inventory of the wine cellar, 3 years of correspondence with his bank. He had looked at the signatures on each one. Not a single one bore a middle initial. Not in 40 years of documents, not in the most formal legal correspondence, not even in a letter to the King's Council in 1947, when one might have expected a man to present his full name. Sir Aldous Vane had always signed himself the same way. Clean, unadorned. The R on the will was not a flourish. It was not an old man's whim on a particular afternoon. It was, Poirot was now quite certain, the mistake of someone who had not known. The question was not whether the signature was forged. He was privately already satisfied on that point, though he would not say so aloud, not yet, not to anyone. The question was when, and by whom, and how, and those 3 questions had a tendency to lead, if followed carefully enough, to a 4th, why now? He dressed with his customary precision, the suit, the shoes buffed to a quiet gleam, the moustaches tended with the small brush he traveled with always, and went downstairs. Mrs. Fitch was already in the kitchen, and the smell of toast and strong tea met him on the stairs. She looked, if possible, more exhausted than the previous evening. She had the appearance of a woman who had slept in her chair and was pretending otherwise. "You were up early," Poirot said, sitting at the kitchen table without ceremony. In grand houses he had long since found, the kitchen table was where the real information lived. "I'm always up at 6, she said, setting a cup before him. Sir Aldous liked his tea at half-past. Force of habit, I suppose. I put the kettle on before I remembered." She sat down heavily across from him. "Stupid." "Not stupid," Poirot said. 22 years is a long time. The habits of care do not simply stop. She looked at him with something that was not quite gratitude, but was close to it. Then she wrapped her hands around her own cup and said, "You were in the study last night. I heard you moving about." "I was. I hope you do not object." "I don't." "I'd have been in there myself if I thought it would do any good." She paused. "Did you find anything?" Poirot considered the question with care. "I found several things of interest," he said. "Tell me." In the days before Sir Aldous died, the last week, perhaps. Was there anything different about him? His appetite, his routine, his colour. Mrs. Fitch was quiet for a moment. He was tired, more than usual. I thought it was his heart again. It gets worse in the cold months, Dr. Crane said that's normal. She frowned at her cup. But he was also irritable, which was not normal. Sir Aldous was never what you'd call cheerful, monsieur, but he wasn't an irritable man. In the last week he was short-tempered with everyone. Sent Roland away on Tuesday when Roland telephoned, told him he didn't want any visitors, and then on Thursday morning he telephoned Mr. Soames himself. She shook her head. That surprised me. He'd been so set against visitors. What changed, do you think? Between Tuesday and Thursday? I don't know. I've been asking myself the same question. She looked up. He had a letter on Wednesday. Hand-delivered. A boy brought it round, not the regular post. Sir Aldous read it in the sitting room, and I heard him. I wasn't listening, monsieur. I simply happened to be in the hallway. I heard him say something. Quite quietly. Something like, so that's how it is. Poirot set his cup down very carefully. And this letter, do you know where it is now? No, I looked for it yesterday when you were talking with the family. It's not in the sitting room, not in the study, as far as I could see. It's gone. Philip Crane arrived at 10 o'clock, which Poirot thought was interesting timing. Late enough to suggest he had not been anxious, early enough to suggest he had not been entirely comfortable waiting. He was a tall man, 50 or so, with a pleasant open face and the unhurried manner of a country doctor. Though his practice was in the city, he had Mrs. Fitch had told. Poirot attended Sir Aldous for the past 2 years following the retirement of the previous physician. He came now ostensibly to collect certain medical records he had left on a previous visit. Poirot met him in the hallway. Dr. Crane, I am Hercule Poirot. I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time. Crane looked at him with the careful neutrality of a man who had been expecting this. Of course. Though I'm not sure what I can add. I've already spoken with the family, and my findings were quite straightforward. Sir Aldous had advanced cardiac disease. His death was entirely consistent with his condition. Yes, entirely consistent. I do not doubt you, doctor. Poirot gestured toward the small parlor. But I'm a man who asks questions as other men breathe. It is simply what I do. Please. They sat. Crane accepted tea from Mrs. Fitch with a nod and folded his long hands in his lap. The digitalis preparation? You prescribed this how long ago? 8 months, approximately. It's a standard treatment for his type of cardiac insufficiency. Regulated dose, he knew precisely how much to take and when. And in the last week, did you examine him? I saw him on Monday. He was weaker than the previous visit, but not alarmingly so. These fluctuations are normal with his condition. His color? His general presentation? Crane paused, almost imperceptibly. He was pale. Slightly nauseated, he said, but he attributed that to something he'd eaten. I didn't disagree at the time. A pause. Nausea can be a symptom of cardiac stress, of course. Of course, Poirot agreed. It can also be a symptom of digitalis toxicity, can it not? When the levels in the blood become elevated. The room was very quiet. Crane looked at Poirot steadily. It can, yes. But Sir Aldous was not taking more than his prescribed dose. I have no reason to believe otherwise. No reason, Poirot murmured. And yet, if someone else had been adding to what he took, without his knowledge. A little more in the brandy, perhaps, over several days. He spread his hands. The symptoms would appear entirely natural, would they not? Entirely consistent with the underlying condition? Crane was silent for a long moment. Then he said quietly, Yes, they would. Roland came downstairs at 11. dressed and composed, and found Poirot in the study. He stopped in the doorway. His eyes went to Poirot. Standing at the desk, the will spread flat before him, and something moved across his face. It was not guilt, not exactly. It was closer to the expression of a chess player who has just noticed that his opponent has moved a piece he wasn't watching. "Monsieur Poirot, is there something specific you're looking for?" "Always," said Poirot cheerfully. He straightened and looked at Roland with pleasant, uncomplicated interest. "Tell me, your uncle's middle name. Do you know it?" Roland blinked. I beg your pardon, his middle name, the initial R on the will. What does it stand for?" A pause. "Brief, but there. Reginald, I believe. After my grandfather." Poirot nodded slowly. "And your uncle, did he use this name? In his correspondence, perhaps? In his signature on letters?" Roland's eyes moved to the will, then back to Poirot. "I honestly couldn't say. I didn't scrutinize his correspondence." "No," said Poirot. "Of course not." He picked up his magnifying glass from the desk and slipped it into his breast pocket. "A small thing. It's probably nothing." He moved toward the door, and Roland stepped aside to let him pass. "Monsieur Poirot," Roland said as Poirot reached the corridor. Poirot turned. "My uncle was an old man with a failing heart." Roland's voice was perfectly even. "He died, as old men with failing hearts do." "I do hope you're not going to make this into something it isn't." Poirot regarded him for a moment with those mild, attentive eyes. "Monsieur Vane," he said at last, gently, "in my long experience, things are very rarely something they are not. They are almost always precisely what they are." He smiled. "It is only the seeing of them that is difficult." He walked away down the corridor and did not look back. But he heard it, faint, behind him, the sound of Roland Vane picking up the will from the desk and turning its pages. Looking, Poirot thought, for something he needed to be sure was still there. Or still hidden. A dead man's secrets the afternoon brought rain. It arrived without warning sometime after lunch. A cold, driving November rain that struck the windows of Vane House at an angle and turned the garden outside into a gray blur. The house felt smaller with the rain against it. The ceiling seemed lower. The corridor seemed narrower. Poirot had noticed this phenomenon before in old houses, the way bad weather did not merely surround them, but somehow entered them, settled into them, became part of their atmosphere. He sat in the small parlor with a second cup of tea going cold beside him and a notebook open on his knee. He was not writing in it, he was thinking. The notebook was a habit he had developed, not because he needed to write things down. His memory was, and had always been, precise to the point of being occasionally inconvenient, but because the physical act of holding a pen over paper seemed to focus the mind. It was the posture of thinking, and the posture, he had found, sometimes preceded the thought. He was thinking about the letter. The hand-delivered letter that Sir Aldous had received on Wednesday. One day before calling his solicitor. One day before signing a will that contradicted everything he had previously intended. "So that's how it is," Mrs. Fitch had heard him say. The letter had since disappeared. This was, Poirot reflected, not the behavior of an innocent document. Someone had removed it. The question of who had access to the study was, technically, everyone in the house. But the question of who had reason to remove it was considerably more specific. He turned the pen over in his fingers. There was also the matter of the brandy. The decanter on the side table in the study. Crystal, good quality, perhaps a third full. One glass used and washed, one unused. Sir Aldous, according to Mrs. Fitch, took a glass of brandy every evening before bed. A single glass, always from the same decanter, always in the study. It was one of the few pleasures he had maintained as his health declined, a single glass of brandy every evening, into which, over 3 or perhaps 4 days, someone had been introducing an additional measure of digitalis. Poirot had not yet said this to anyone except, in the careful hypothetical language he had used, to Dr. Crane that morning. He did not intend to say it to anyone until he was certain not only of the method but of the hand behind it. In his younger days, he had occasionally allowed enthusiasm to outpace evidence. He had learned over time to wait. Evidence properly attended to arrived in its own order. The investigator's task was to be ready for it. He picked up his tea, found it cold, and set it down again. It was Mrs. Fitch, who came to him at 2:30, her face arranged in the expression of someone delivering information they are not certain they should possess. "There's something I didn't tell you," she said, sitting down across from him without being asked, which told Poirot she had been working up to this for some time. "About Dr. Crane." Poirot set the notebook aside. "Go on." "Thursday, I think, because I remember I was doing the silver. Dr. Crane came to the house, unscheduled. Not his regular visiting day." She folded her hands in her lap. "He said he'd been passing and thought he'd look in on Sir Aldous. I showed him upstairs. He was with Sir Aldous for about half an hour. When he came down he seemed, I don't know the word exactly, not upset, but not himself. Did he go into the study? Sir Aldous's bedroom is adjacent to the study. There's a connecting door, though it's rarely used. I couldn't say whether Dr. Crane went through it. I wasn't watching every moment." Poirot was quiet for a beat. "Then, did Dr. Crane go near the study on any other occasion? Any previous visit?" Mrs. Fitch hesitated. "Once, in September. Sir Aldous asked me to show him to the study. Said he wanted to discuss something private. They were in there for perhaps 40 minutes. She paused. "I noticed afterward that the brandy decanter had been moved. It was in a slightly different position on the table. I thought I'd moved it myself while dusting and forgotten. But you had not. I don't think so, no?" Poirot nodded slowly. He was silent for long enough that Mrs. Fitch shifted in her chair. "Is he the one?" she asked quietly. "Dr. Crane?" And here Poirot did something he would later consider a mistake. Not a catastrophic one, but the kind of small professional error that comes from allowing a preliminary impression to harden too quickly into conviction. He had been thinking about Crane since the morning. The unscheduled visit, the moved decanter, the careful, calibrated answers. The pause, that slight, almost invisible pause, when Poirot had raised the question of digitalis toxicity. "It is possible," Poirot said. "Dr. Crane had access. He had knowledge. He had opportunity on multiple occasions." He tapped his pen against the notebook. "I think Dr. Crane requires considerably more scrutiny. He believed it in that moment. He would later acknowledge to himself with characteristic honesty, quite wrong. He found Cecily Vane in the dining room at 3:00, sitting at the long table with a cup of coffee and a cigarette, and a look of someone who had been alone with their thoughts for slightly too long. She looked up when he entered and gestured at the chair across from her with the hand that held the cigarette. An informal invitation, but a genuine one. "I wondered when you'd get to me," she said. "Roland had his interview yesterday evening, didn't he? In the drawing room." "That was more of a conversation," Poirot said, sitting down. "A preliminary one. And this?"
Also a conversation.
He smiled. "I find that interviews make people careful. Conversations sometimes make them honest." Cecily looked at him with those quick, intelligent eyes. She took a long draw on her cigarette and exhaled slowly toward the ceiling. "All right. What do you want to know?" "Tell me about your uncle." She was quiet for a moment, not evasively, more in the way of someone selecting which truth to offer from several available. He was not an easy man to know. He didn't particularly want to be known, I think. He built this house into a kind of fortress over the years, not from the world exactly, but from intimacy, from needing anyone. She tapped ash into the saucer of her coffee cup. He'd been hurt, I think, when he was younger. He never spoke of it. But you could see the shape of it, if that makes sense. It makes considerable sense, Poirot said. And your relationship with him, it was good? It was honest. Which is better, in my experience. She smiled faintly. He told me things he didn't tell Roland, because Roland always wanted something from him, and Uncle Aldous knew it. I wanted things too. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I was less elegant about hiding it, and oddly he seemed to prefer that. What did you want from him? A pause. The cigarette moved to her lips and away again. Money, she said simply. I'm in debt, considerably. I made some poor decisions 2 years ago. An investment that went badly, and then some personal expenditure that I handled irresponsibly. Her voice was level, without self-pity. I asked Uncle Aldous for a loan 8 months ago. He refused, but not unkindly. He said he didn't believe in loans between family members because they ruined both the money and the relationship. A short laugh. Very him, that. And did you press the matter? Once more in September, he refused again, more firmly. She looked at Poirot steadily. I did not then decide to murder him for his inheritance, Monsieur Poirot, if that's what you're navigating toward. I was not navigating toward anything, Poirot said mildly. I was listening. There is a difference. He paused. The new will, you know its contents? Roland told me this morning. Apparently everything goes to him. Her voice was carefully neutral. I won't pretend I'm not surprised. Uncle Aldous told me, in September, that he intended to leave the house to a charitable trust. I believed him. He was not a man who said things he didn't mean. And yet the will says otherwise. And yet the will says otherwise, she agreed. She crushed out the cigarette. Which is why you're here, isn't it? Because someone changed his mind for him. Or changed his signature. She said it without drama, looking directly at him. Poirot regarded her with interest. You have considered this possibility yourself, he said. I've thought of little else since Roland told me about the will this morning. She pushed the coffee cup aside. Here is what I know about my uncle, Monsieur Poirot. He was stubborn as old oak. Once he had decided something, he did not undecide it. He told me in September that Roland would not get the house. He meant it. He meant it the way he meant everything, completely, without room for revision. She met Poirot's gaze. So, either someone changed his mind with something powerful enough to overturn 40 years of character, or they didn't bother trying. The rain drove hard against the dining room windows. Somewhere upstairs a door closed. Tell me, Poirot said after a moment. The forged check. 6 months ago. Cecily went very still. It was not the stillness of guilt, precisely. It was something more complicated. The stillness of a person recalibrating the distance between what they thought someone knew and what he actually knew. Which was, Poirot reflected, a useful distinction. How did you? She began. I did not know, Poirot said gently. Until this moment, I suspected there was a financial irregularity of some kind. Your manner when discussing your debts was that of someone managing not to mention something adjacent. He folded his hands. Tell me. A long silence, the rain, the cold room. I forged a check, she said at last, from Uncle Aldous's account, 6 months ago, when things were very bad. £400. She looked at the table. He found out. Of course he found out. I went to him and confessed before the bank contacted him. He was, He was very quiet, which was worse than if he'd shouted. She pressed her fingers against her lips briefly. He told me he would not go to the police. He said I would repay it over time, from my allowance, and that we would not speak of it again. And Roland, does he know? No. Uncle Aldous kept it between us. She looked up, which is precisely why this will make no sense to me. A man who protected me from my own worst behavior does not then sign everything over to Roland without a word to anyone. It's not him. It is simply not him. Poirot looked at her for a long time. There was something here that he was close to. A shape in the information like a figure seen through frosted glass. Not yet clear, but present, waiting for the right angle. One more question, he said. Mr. Soames, the solicitor, have you known him long? Cecily frowned at the change of direction. Since childhood, more or less. He handled our father's estate. He's been Uncle Aldous's solicitor for 20 years. He came here yesterday evening, uninvited. Yes, Roland mentioned it. Did it strike you as unusual? She considered. Leonard Soames does everything for a reason. He doesn't make social calls. If he came here yesterday evening without being asked, she stopped. Yes, now that you say it that way. Yes, it strikes me as unusual. Good, said Poirot. He rose from the chair and straightened his jacket. When things strike us as unusual, mademoiselle, it is generally because they are. He excused himself and walked out into the hallway and stood for a moment at the foot of the stairs. He had told Mrs. Fitch that Dr. Crane required more scrutiny. He was no longer sure that was right. He had moved too quickly this morning, assembled the accessible facts into the nearest available shape. Dr. Crane had opportunity, yes, but opportunity without clear motive was only half an argument. And there was something in Cecily's account. The forged check, the will, the letter that had disappeared, that pointed in a direction that had nothing to do with the physician. He put one hand on the banister and looked up the stairs toward the study. The letter. That was the thread. Find the letter, or find who had taken it, and the shape in the frosted glass would come clear. He began to climb. The grey cells grow restless. Poirot did not find the letter that afternoon. He searched the study with the methodical patience that had served him across 4 decades and 2 continents. Every drawer opened, every document lifted and replaced, every book tilted forward to reveal what might lie behind it on the shelf. He checked behind the fireplace grate, inside the brass coal scuttle, beneath the leather desk mat. He examined the wastepaper basket, which contained 3 crumpled envelopes, all old, all innocuous, and a length of sealing wax ribbon in dark red. No letter. He stood in the center of the study when he had finished and looked at the room around him with the expression of a man who has asked a question and received an answer he doesn't entirely like. The absence of the letter was itself information, of course. Someone had removed it deliberately. Someone who knew what it said and understood that what it said was dangerous. But who had been in the study? Roland, certainly. For an hour yesterday afternoon, by Mrs. Fitch's account. Soames had been in the house yesterday evening, though Mrs. Fitch had not shown him upstairs. Crane had been here 2 weeks ago, and again in September. Cecily claimed she had not been in the study at all. Claim? Poirot moved to the desk and sat down in Sir Aldous's chair. Something he did not do lightly, and never without a particular quiet feeling of intrusion, and placed his hands flat on the leather surface and looked at the room from the dead man's perspective. What? The door, straight ahead. The window to the left, the grey garden, the bare oak, the stone bench. The bookcase to the right, and there, on the corner of the desk, the will, held by the green glass paperweight. He picked up the paperweight, turned it over in his hands. It was heavier than it looked. Solid glass, the kind of object one kept for no particular reason except that it had always been there. On its base, barely visible, 3 initials etched into the glass. H-E-V. Not Aldous, not Roland, not Cecily. He set it down and filed the initials away without yet knowing where they belonged. At 4 o'clock, the rain eased to a grey drizzle, and Poirot put on his coat and hat and walked out of Vane House through the side door into the garden. He needed to think, and he thought better moving than sitting. This was, he was aware, somewhat inconsistent with his general preference for comfort and indoor temperatures. But the brain had its own requirements, and occasionally they overruled the body. The garden was small and walled, the kind that had once been kept with some pride and had declined gently over the years into a state of what might charitably be called naturalism. The box hedges along the side walls had grown into irregular shapes. A rose bush near the back wall had been left unpruned for so many seasons that it was now more architecture than horticulture, a dense tangle of old wood and dead canes, with a few hips still clinging to the uppermost branches in a dull, withered red. Poirot walked the perimeter slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his shoes picking their way carefully across the wet gravel path. He was thinking about Roland Vane. He had been moving toward Roland since yesterday evening. The tightened hand on the brandy glass, the hour spent alone in the study, the smooth and carefully managed performance in the drawing room. But performing was not the same as guilty, and Poirot had been misled before by men who performed innocence badly while being innocent, and by men who performed it beautifully while being anything but. What did he actually know about Roland? He knew that Roland had telephoned Sir Aldous on Tuesday, 2 days before the will was signed, and been turned away. He knew that Roland had gone immediately to the study upon arriving at Vane House, and spent an hour there alone. He knew that Roland had been aware of the contents of the old will, and stood to receive nothing under it. He knew that Roland had answered Poirot's questions with the practiced ease of a man who had anticipated them. And he knew, or rather he had begun to strongly suspect, that Roland had known about the middle initial, had known and had used it. The slight hesitation when Poirot had asked, "Reginald, I believe," the answer of a man reaching for a piece of information rather than producing it from familiarity. But the letter still troubled him. If Roland had forged the will, and Poirot was now, in the privacy of his own thinking, fairly settled on this, then the letter Sir Aldous received on Wednesday was either connected or coincidental. In Poirot's experience, coincidences existed. He did not discount them on principle. But they were, in his estimation, considerably rarer than people liked to believe, and in the presence of a possible crime they deserved the deepest suspicion. What might the letter have said? Something that prompted Sir Aldous to call his solicitor. Something that made him say, "So that's how it is." Not surprise exactly, more like confirmation. The confirmation of something he had already suspected, but had not wished to believe. A betrayal, perhaps, the discovery of one. He stopped walking and stood looking at the rose bush. Something was assembling itself in his mind, not fully formed yet, not quite, but moving toward form the way clouds move toward a shape before the wind changes and disperses them. He needed one more thing, one more piece that he did not yet have. He turned and walked back inside. He found Soames in the hallway preparing to leave. The solicitor had his coat on and his briefcase in hand, and wore the expression of a man who has concluded his business and is grateful for it. He looked up when Poirot appeared at the end of the corridor, and for a fraction of a second, a very small fraction, Something moved across his face that was not quite relief at departure. "Monsieur Soames." Poirot moved toward him with unhurried purpose. "I am glad to have caught you." "One small question, if you will permit." Soames set his briefcase down, which was either patience or resignation. "Of course. Yesterday evening, you came here uninvited. You said there were procedural matters relating to probate. That's correct. And were those matters resolved?" A pause. "Sufficiently, yes." "Good." Poirot clasped his hands before him. "Now, when you came on Thursday to witness the signing, you arrived at 12:30, you said. Perhaps 1:15, as I told you." "Yes." Poirot looked at him with mild, steady attention. "And yet Mrs. Fitch tells me she heard the gate. The front gate, you understand. The one that makes a considerable noise. She heard it at 12:20. Perhaps a few minutes earlier." He paused. "Which would suggest you arrived somewhat before you have stated." The hallway was very quiet. Somewhere in the house a clock ticked. Soames looked at Poirot for a long moment. Then he said carefully, "I may have the time slightly wrong. It was several days ago." "Of course. Memory is imperfect." Poirot nodded sympathetically. "But you understand why the timing interests me. If you arrived at, let us say, 12:15, and Sir Aldous did not sign the will until, according to your own account, shortly after 1:00, then there is a period of some 45 minutes in which you were present in this house before the signing took place." He tilted his head slightly. "What were you doing during those 45 minutes, Monsieur Soames?" Another silence. "Longer this time. I was with Sir Aldous," Soames said at last, "in his sitting room. We spoke before the formal signing. He wanted to. He had questions about the implications of the changes he was making." "He had questions," Poirot repeated, "about changes to his own will. Changes which he himself had initiated. People often have questions at the last moment. It's entirely normal. And these questions, they were resolved to his satisfaction? They were. And then he signed." Soames confirmed, his voice steady. Poirot regarded him for a moment longer. Then he smiled pleasantly and stepped aside. "Thank you, Monsieur Soames. You have been most helpful." Soames picked up his briefcase, nodded once, and moved to the front door. He opened it onto the drizzling afternoon. "Monsieur Soames," Poirot said, just as the solicitor stepped across the threshold. Soames paused without turning fully around. "The paperweight on Sir Aldous's desk. The green glass one. The initials on the base, HEV. Do you know whose they were?" "A beat." Then Soames turned his head just far enough to answer. "Sir Aldous's mother," he said quietly. "Helena Evelyn Vane. It was hers." He paused. "He kept it on his desk for 40 years. Said it reminded him to be careful." The door closed. Poirot stood in the empty hallway, and the quiet of the house settled around him like something physical, reminded him to be careful. And yet, at the end, he had not been careful enough. At 6:00, Poirot made his error. It was not a large error. It was not the kind of error that led anywhere catastrophic. But it was an error, and Poirot, who prided himself, perhaps excessively, on the precision of his conclusions, would remember it with a small private wince for some time afterward. Inspector Crail of the local CD had been introduced to Poirot that morning, briefly, in the manner of a man who had been told to cooperate with a famous Belgian detective, and had decided to do so with minimal enthusiasm. He was a solid, deliberate man in his early 50s, with the patient eyes of someone who had spent a career dealing with things that were exactly what they appeared to be, and was not especially welcoming of the suggestion that this case might be different. Crail telephoned at 6, and Poirot took the call in the parlor. "You've been asking about Crane," Crail said, without preamble. the doctor. "I have made certain inquiries, yes." "Well, I've had a look at him since you flagged it. His financials are clean. No unusual withdrawals, no connection to the Vane estate beyond the medical relationship. His other patients confirm he's regular, professional, nothing odd. And his housekeeper confirms he was home Thursday evening from 7 o'clock onward." A pause. "So whatever angle you were working on, Crane, I'd let it go." Poirot was quiet for a moment. He had that morning suggested to Crail, carefully, provisionally, but still suggested, that Dr. Crane merited investigation. He had based this on the unscheduled visit, the moved decanter, the careful manner. He had let the preliminary impression run slightly ahead of his better judgment. He had been wrong. "Inspector," he said, "you are quite right. I moved too quickly in that direction, Doctor. Crane was a line of inquiry I have since reconsidered." Crail sounded mildly surprised to find him agreeable. "Right, well, glad we're on the same page. There is, however, another matter I wish to raise with you. The will. I would like the signature examined by a document specialist. There is a specific detail which I believe warrants professional analysis." A pause. "What detail?" "The middle initial," Poirot said. "In 40 years of documents in this house, Sir Aldous Vane never once signed his middle initial. The will bears the signature Aldous R. Vane. I believe this signature was not written by Sir Aldous." A longer pause. "That's a serious allegation, Monsieur Poirot." "It is a serious situation, Inspector." Poirot kept his voice gentle. "I do not make it lightly, but if I am correct, and I am becoming increasingly confident that I am, then we are not dealing with a natural death. We are dealing with a murder, carefully planned, carefully concealed, and carried out by someone who lives, or nearly lives, in this house." The line was quiet for a long moment. "I'll arrange the document examination," Crail said at last. "Tomorrow morning." "Thank you, Inspector." Poirot paused. "And one further thing. I should like you to find out, if you are able, who sent a hand-delivered letter to Sir Aldous Vane on Wednesday afternoon. A letter which has since disappeared from this house. I'll see what I can do." "Excellent." Poirot set the telephone receiver down and sat for a moment in the quiet parlor, his hands resting on his knees. He thought about Dr. Crane and about the morning's mistake and allowed himself precisely 30 seconds of private self-reproach. Then he set it aside. The grey cells, as he sometimes said, though usually only to himself, moments of genuine exasperation, had the right to rest. They did not have the right to be wrong, but they were occasionally. And the recovery from being wrong was simply this: return to the beginning, set aside what you thought you knew, and look again. He reached for his notebook. At the top of a fresh page he wrote 3 things. The letter, Wednesday. Soames arrived early. Why? R. Reginald. He looked at the 3rd item for a long time. Then slowly he drew a single line through it and wrote beneath it, in slightly larger letters, "Did Roland know the middle name at all?" He closed the notebook. Outside, the drizzle had stopped. The garden was perfectly dark and perfectly silent, and somewhere in Vane House, above his head, a floorboard creaked, the slow, deliberate creak of someone moving carefully, trying not to be heard. Poirot looked at the ceiling. Then he rose quietly and went to see. The wrong name. The floorboard creaked again. Poirot stood at the bottom of the staircase and listened with the particular quality of attention he reserved for sounds that did not wish to be noticed. It was coming from the 1st floor, not the study end of the corridor, but the other end, near the room that misses. Fitch had told him was used as a secondary sitting room, and had been locked since Sir Aldous's decline began in September. He climbed the stairs without turning on the corridor light. His hand found the banister in the dark, and he went up slowly, placing each foot with care, keeping close to the wall where the boards were least likely to protest. At the top, he stopped and waited. The corridor stretched away from him in both directions, dimly lit by the faint light coming from beneath the study door at one end. From the other end, silence now. But the kind of silence that follows movement rather than precedes it. He moved toward it. The door of the secondary sitting room was not locked. It stood very slightly ajar, perhaps 2 inches, and through the gap came a thin bar of torchlight that swept and paused and swept again across the far wall. Poirot put one hand flat against the door and pushed it open. Mrs. Fitch spun around with a sharp intake of breath, the torch swinging wildly across the ceiling before she steadied it. In its backwash, her face was white and startled, the face of a woman caught and knowing it, and trying to decide whether to apologize or explain first. She chose explain. "I was looking for the letter," she said. Her voice was unsteady, but her chin was up. "The one Sir Aldous received on Wednesday. I thought, if he'd read it in here, perhaps." "He did not read it in here," Poirot said gently. "He read it in the sitting room downstairs. You told me so yourself." "I know. But I've already looked there twice." She lowered the torch so it was no longer aimed at either of them. "I couldn't sleep. I needed to do something." Poirot stepped into the room and closed the door softly behind him. He looked around in the torch's ambient glow. The secondary sitting room was smaller than the main one, and less deliberately maintained. A room that had served various purposes over the years and had settled into a kind of comfortable accumulation. 2 armchairs, a small writing desk against the far wall, shelves of miscellaneous objects, old photographs in frames, a stack of bound journals, a wooden cigar box, several folded maps. And on the writing desk, pulled slightly away from the wall, the corner of something white. Poirot crossed the room in 4 steps. It was an envelope, plain white, no postmark, hand-delivered as Mrs. Fitch had said, with Sir Aldous written on the front in a hand that was careful and deliberate, and told Poirot immediately that whoever had written it had been trying, consciously, to disguise their natural writing. The envelope was empty. The letter itself was gone, but the envelope had not been thrown away. It had been placed here, not hidden exactly, but set aside, as a man might set aside an empty container that he was not yet ready to discard, as if he had not quite decided what to do with it. "It was here all along," Mrs. Fitch said from behind him, her voice quiet. "The envelope, yes." The letter was removed by someone who did not notice, or did not think to take, the envelope as well. Poirot held it carefully by its edges, examining the handwriting on the front. "They took the content and left the container. A small error." He turned it over. On the back flap, barely visible, a partial impression in the paper, the ghost of writing where a pen had pressed through from the sheet beneath. Someone had used this envelope as a writing surface at some point, or something had been written on top of it. He angled it toward the torchlight. 3 letters. Incomplete. The first one almost entirely lost, but the last 2 clear enough. All. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he placed the envelope carefully in his breast pocket. "Go to bed, Madame Fitch," he said, not unkindly. "You have been very helpful. More helpful than you know." He was at the writing desk in his room by 9 o'clock, the envelope before him, a lamp positioned at the precise angle that served best. He took a sheet of hotel notepaper from his bag. He traveled always with his own, and a soft pencil, and laid the paper over the impression on the envelope back and rubbed the pencil lightly across it. An old method, simple and reliable. The indented letters came up as white against the gray graphite ground. All. The first letter was entirely absent, lost where the envelope's paper had been pressed rather than indented. The second was partial, a curved upstroke that might have been a capital R or a B or a P. The last two were unambiguous, O and L, 3 letters, the end of a name. Poirot sat back and looked at the ceiling. Roland. No, Roland ended in and. He frowned. He picked up his pen and wrote on the notepaper, names ending in O. Athol, Errol, Carol. He paused. Leonard. No, that ended in Ard. He wrote more slowly. Raoul, Oriole. He stopped. He wrote one more name, Symbol. No, not a name. He crossed it out. He sat very still. And then something shifted in his mind. One of those quiet, decisive movements that happened not dramatically, but with the certainty of a key finding its lock. And he understood. It was not the end of a name. It was the end of a word. All. He wrote anal. He wrote digitanol. He set the pen down. Digitanol was the brand name of a digitalis preparation, one of several on the market, used in the treatment of cardiac conditions. He had known this for 30 years. The prescription bottle on the hallway table downstairs. He closed his eyes and recalled it precisely, as he could recall almost anything he had genuinely looked at. Bore the label Dr. P. Crane, digitalis preparation, a generic description, not a brand name. But if someone had written to Sir Aldous, had warned him perhaps about something they had discovered or suspected, and had used the specific brand name in that letter, he opened his eyes. Sir Aldous had received the letter on Wednesday, he had said, so that's how it is. He had then called his solicitor the following morning, not to change his will out of sudden generosity toward Roland, but to change it in order to do something else entirely. Something Poirot had not yet understood the shape of. Perhaps to protect something, perhaps to expose someone, perhaps to leave, in the legal document itself, some kind of record. Except that he had not lived long enough, and the will that existed now was not the will he had signed. Poirot stood up from the desk and walked to the window. The street below was empty, the dark, wet pavement reflecting the lamplight in long orange streaks. He stood there for perhaps 5 minutes, thinking with the focused, undecorated clarity that came when all the preliminary confusion had been stripped away and only the essential structure remained. The letter had warned Sir Aldous he was being poisoned. He had called Soames, not to change his will in Roland's favor, but for some other purpose entirely. Perhaps to change it against Roland. Perhaps to add a codicil. Perhaps simply to have a solicitor present as a witness to something he intended to say or to document. But someone had known he'd called Soames, and that someone had moved very quickly indeed. The will that Soames had witnessed on Thursday afternoon was not the will Sir Aldous had intended to create. Soames had either been deceived into witnessing a document substituted at the last moment, or Soames had been involved. Poirot turned from the window. There was one way to know. He found Cecily in the upstairs corridor at 9:30, coming from the bathroom with her hair down, wearing a dark housecoat and carrying a glass of water. She stopped when she saw him. Under the corridor light, she looked younger than she had downstairs, and more tired, and more genuinely afraid than she had allowed herself to appear in company. Monsieur Poirot? She glanced down the corridor toward the other doors. Is something wrong? Not wrong, he said quietly. But I have a question which I must ask you now, and I ask that you answer it with complete honesty. He paused. Can you do that? She studied him for a moment. Then she nodded. Your uncle called Mr. Soames on Thursday morning. You have told me you believe he would not have changed his will in Roland's favor, that it was not in his character. I agree with you. He kept his voice low. Do you know? Do you have any reason to believe That your uncle might have called Soames not to benefit Roland, but to take some action against him? Cecily was very still. Yes, she said, after a long moment. Poirot waited. 3 weeks ago, she said. Uncle Aldous telephoned me. Not his usual call, not scheduled. He rang in the evening and he asked me, very directly, whether I knew anything about Roland borrowing against Uncle Aldous's investment accounts. She pressed the glass of water against her chest as if for warmth. I didn't know what he was talking about. I told him so. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said he was going to look into it, and he would let me know what he found. Her voice dropped. He never called back. I should have pushed. I should have called him. But I thought he was managing it himself, the way he always managed everything himself. Roland had been accessing his uncle's investment accounts, Poirot said, less as a question than as a thing becoming certain. I think so, yes. And the letter Sir Aldous received on Wednesday. Poirot kept his eyes on her, steady, careful. Who do you think sent it? She was quiet for a long moment. Down the corridor, somewhere the old house settled. A board contracted in the cold. I think, she said slowly, that someone at the bank found out and decided to warn him. She looked at Poirot. Or someone else who knew. Someone who'd seen something they shouldn't have. Someone, Poirot said, whose name ends in O. She frowned. I don't. It is not important yet, he said. Get some rest, mademoiselle. He turned to go. Tomorrow will require clear heads, Monsieur Poirot. Her voice stopped him. You know who did it, don't you? He paused with his back to her. I know, he said quietly. Almost everything. There is one small piece remaining. He turned his head just enough that she could see his profile. But almost everything when the crime is murder is not sufficient. Everything is what is required. He paused. By tomorrow evening I shall have it. He walked back to his room and closed the door. He sat at the writing desk for another hour, the envelope before him, his notebook open, the lamp burning low. He wrote and crossed out and wrote again. He thought about Roland's careful face and Soames's white knuckles, and the bottle of digitalis on the hallway table, and the missing letter, and the glass paperweight with a dead woman's initials, and he thought about a signature, Aldous R. Vane, that did not belong, the R, that had been added by someone who knew Sir Aldous's middle name, or thought they did, but had never, in 40 years of living alongside the man, noticed that he never used it. The detail that only a person at a certain distance would miss. And Roland Vane, for all his careful management of the appearance of closeness, had always been, Poirot now understood, at a very considerable distance from his uncle. Present at Christmas, present on birthdays, never truly known. He closed the notebook, one piece remaining. He would find it in the morning. The last signature Poirot was downstairs before anyone else. He had slept, finally, at some point after midnight, a short, efficient sleep of the kind his body had learned to take when his mind required it, like a machine briefly shutting down for maintenance, before resuming at full capacity. He woke at 6:30, with the particular clarity that sometimes follows concentrated thinking, dressed with his customary care, and went down to the kitchen, where the range was still warm from Mrs. Fitch's early rising. He made himself tea. He stood at the kitchen window and watched the garden come out of the dark, the frost on the dead lawn silvering as the pale light grew, the bare oak becoming gradually distinct against the grey sky, the stone bench acquiring its familiar cold solidity. It was a quiet morning. Still, the rain of the previous days had cleared, leaving the air sharp and clean and very cold. He thought about what he needed. The document examiner arranged by Inspector Crail had confirmed, at 8 o'clock by telephone, what Poirot had already known. The signature on the will showed characteristics inconsistent with Sir Aldous' verified samples. The pressure patterns were wrong. The letter formation in the capital A differed from every comparable sample in the house. The middle initial R had been formed by someone whose natural writing produced a particular closed loop at the top of the letter, a loop absent from every other R in Sir Aldous' 40 years of correspondence. It was not his signature. The examiner was prepared to say so in court. This was the confirmation Poirot had needed. Not the final piece was something else. Something smaller and more human, the kind of detail that could only be found by asking the right question of the right person at the right moment. But the document examination closed the door on any remaining doubt about the central fact. The will was forged. Sir Aldous Vane had been murdered. And Poirot knew, with the quiet certainty that had settled over him in the small hours of the previous night, who had done it, and how, and very nearly why. The why had one remaining corner that needed illuminating, the letter and the name ending in ol. But he had a theory about that too, and he intended to test it this morning before bringing everyone together. He finished his tea, rinsed the cup, and set it on the draining board with a precision that Mrs. Fitch would have approved of. Then he put on his coat and went out. The offices of Calloway and Soames, solicitors, occupied the first floor of a narrow Georgian building in Holborn, reached by a staircase that smelled of beeswax and old carpet. Poirot arrived at 9:15, before the morning appointments had begun, and gave his card to the young woman at the reception desk with a pleasantness that made refusal feel impolite. Soames saw him in his office within 10 minutes. The solicitor was seated behind his desk when Poirot was shown in, and he had the look of a man who had been expecting this visit, and had spent the intervening time deciding what to say. His desk was clear except for a single file and a cup of coffee. He did not offer Poirot coffee. He gestured at the chair opposite and waited. "Monsieur Soames," Poirot began, settling himself and placing his hat on his knee, "I will not take much of your time. The document examiner has confirmed this morning that the signature on Sir Aldous' will is a forgery. Inspector Crail will be at Vane House this afternoon. There will be arrests made." He paused. "I thought you might prefer to speak with me before that happened." Soames looked at him steadily. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "I am not implying anything. I am telling you directly." Poirot's voice was gentle, without accusation, the tone of a man delivering difficult information rather than making an attack. "You arrived at Vane House on Thursday at 12:15, perhaps a few minutes earlier. Sir Aldous had called you that morning with a specific purpose, not to change his will in Roland's favor, but to take legal action against Roland for the unauthorized use of his investment accounts. He had discovered from a letter received the day before that Roland had been systematically withdrawing funds, small amounts, carefully timed, for at least 8 months. Soames said nothing. His hands were flat on the desk. "You arrived early," Poirot continued, "and Roland was already there. He had come, not because he was invited. He was specifically not invited. Sir Aldous had turned him away on Tuesday, but because he knew. He knew his uncle had called you, and he knew why, and he knew that the conversation that was about to take place would destroy him." Poirot paused. "He spoke to you in the 45 minutes before Sir Aldous came downstairs. He showed you the will he had prepared, a will he had drawn up himself, using his knowledge of legal documents from his years in commercial law, and forged with Sir Aldous' signature. A will leaving everything to Roland." He watched Soames's face carefully. And he told you," Poirot said quietly, "that if you witnessed it, if you added your signature as the attending solicitor, gave it the legal weight it required, he would not reveal something you had done or failed to do in your handling of the Vane estate, something that would cost you your career and possibly your liberty." The office was very quiet. "He blackmailed you," Poirot said. Soames's composure did not break, but something behind it gave way, slowly, like a wall that has held water too long finally beginning to seep. He looked at Poirot, and the careful professional blankness in his face shifted into something older and more tired and considerably more honest. "I made an error," he said at last, 3 years ago. "In the management of a trust, not the Vane estate, another client entirely. I transferred funds incorrectly and covered it before any loss occurred. But the paperwork, if it were examined," he stopped. "Roland found out. I don't know how. He came to me 6 months ago and told me he knew. He said he would say nothing provided I remained. Cooperative." "Cooperative," Poirot repeated. "He didn't tell me about the will until Thursday." "Until that morning." Soames's voice had gone very flat, the flatness of a man describing something he cannot yet fully accept having done. "He was already there when I arrived. He showed me the document. He told me what Sir Aldous had intended to do, and what it would mean for Roland. And he told me that if I did not witness the will, he would go to the Law Society that same afternoon." He looked at his desk. I told myself that Sir Aldous was dying anyway. That the heart condition—" "He was dying," Poirot said, not without compassion. "Faster than you knew." Roland had been introducing additional digitalis into his brandy for at least 4 days. By Thursday morning, Sir Aldous was already gravely ill, though he did not know the cause. He signed nothing. He was brought downstairs after Roland and I had, after the document was prepared, and Roland told him Soames had come about the accounts, that it was a preliminary meeting, that the formal legal action could wait until he was stronger. He paused. "Sir Aldous believed this. He was weakened and frightened, and he trusted you, Monsieur Soames, as he had trusted you for 20 years. He sat in the armchair in his sitting room and spoke to you about what he had discovered, and you listened, and said nothing of what was in your briefcase." Soames pressed his fingers against his eyes briefly. A gesture of a man who has been carrying something very heavy and has simply finally set it down. "He went back upstairs at 2 o'clock, Soames said. He said he was tired. He wanted to rest before the proper meeting." His voice was barely above a speaking tone now. "He died at 6 o'clock. Roland telephoned me at 7. He said it was done, and that I should file the will without delay on Monday morning, and that we need never speak of Thursday again." "But you came to Vane House yesterday evening," Poirot said. I panicked. The word came out with a rawness that sounded entirely genuine. "When I heard you were there, who you were, I needed to see Roland. To tell him," he stopped. "To tell him that a Belgian detective with a reputation for noticing small things was in the house," Poirot finished. "Yes. I thought it might be something of that nature." He rose from the chair and picked up his hat. "Monsieur Soames, Inspector Crail will wish to speak with you today. I would strongly recommend that you are available and that you tell him precisely what you have told me." He paused. "You did not plan this crime. You did not know, when you agreed to witness the will, that Sir Aldous had been poisoned. These are not small considerations." Soames looked up at him. "Will it matter?" "It will matter," Poirot said. "Perhaps not as much as you would wish, but it will matter." He left the office and went down the beeswax staircase and out into the cold Holborn morning. The final piece, he reflected, had been exactly where he expected it to be. It had simply required asking. Inspector Crail arrived at Vane House at 2 o'clock with 2 constables, and the particular expression of a man who has been told he was wrong about something, and has decided to respond to this by being very professionally correct about everything going forward. Poirot had telephoned ahead. Roland and Cecily were both in the house. Mrs. Fitch had made sandwiches that no one ate, and a pot of tea that everyone drank, standing in the kitchen with her hands wrapped around her cup, and her eyes moving to the ceiling every time a footstep sounded from above. At 2:30, Poirot gathered everyone in the drawing room. It was, he was aware, a somewhat theatrical arrangement. The chairs positioned in a rough semicircle, the fire lit, the gray afternoon light coming through the tall windows. He had done this many times before, in many rooms, in many countries, and he was not so lacking in self-knowledge as to pretend he did not find it, on some level, satisfying. The arrangement of people, the architecture of a revelation, these were not perhaps the most admirable of satisfactions, but they were his. Roland sat to the left of the fireplace in an upright chair, his legs crossed, his expression composed. He had not been told why they were gathered. He had looked at the constables in the hallway with a single flicker of something behind his eyes, quickly extinguished, and then resumed his careful performance of a man with nothing to hide. Cecily sat across from him, her hands in her lap, her face open and still. Mrs. Fitch stood near the door. Inspector Crail stood to one side with his notebook and the expression of professional correctness. Poirot stood before the fireplace. He looked at Roland Vane for a moment without speaking. In his experience, the guilty, the calculating, cold-blooded guilty, as opposed to the passionate and the desperate, did not look away under this kind of scrutiny. They met it because they had rehearsed for it, because they had told themselves the story of their innocence so many times it had acquired the texture of truth. Roland met his gaze with a faint, polite inquiry in his expression, as if he were waiting for an elderly relative to finish a mildly interesting anecdote. "Monsieur Van," Poirot began, "I will tell you what happened. You may correct me if I am wrong." Roland inclined his head slightly. "Permission granted," the gesture said. The performance continued. "You have been withdrawing funds from your uncle's investment accounts for 8 months. Small amounts, carefully chosen, carefully timed, but accumulating to a significant sum. You did this because you needed money, and because you had calculated, correctly, that Sir Aldous did not monitor these accounts closely, and that by the time any irregularity was noticed you intended to be his heir and the point would be moot." Poirot paused. "What you did not anticipate was that Sir Aldous would be warned." He saw it, the very smallest contraction around Roland's eyes, there and gone. "The letter arrived on Wednesday. It was sent by a junior clerk at the investment firm, a young man named Nicholas Capel, who had noticed the withdrawal some weeks earlier and had been debating whether to act. He decided finally to write directly to Sir Aldous rather than to his superiors." Poirot reached into his breast pocket and produced the plain white envelope. He signed the letter with his surname, Capel, ending, as you see, in "ol." He set the envelope on the mantelpiece. Sir Aldous read the letter. He understood immediately what it meant. He telephoned his solicitor, not to benefit you but to ruin you, legally and completely. He intended to have you prosecuted. Poirot's voice remained even, without heat. You knew he had called Soames because you had been monitoring his telephone calls. You had bribed the exchange operator, a fact Inspector Crail has this morning confirmed. You knew what Thursday's meeting was for, and so you acted with considerable speed. Roland uncrossed his legs. a small movement, barely perceptible. You had been adding digitalis to your uncle's brandy for 4 days, since Sunday evening when you dined here, ostensibly as a concerned nephew. You had obtained additional digitalis, not from Dr. Crane's prescription, which was monitored, but from a private source, a matter that is currently being investigated. 4 days of elevated dosage produced the symptoms: nausea, fatigue, irregular heartbeat, all entirely consistent with his underlying condition. By Thursday, he was gravely weakened. He would, in all likelihood, have died within another day or two regardless. This is, Roland said, his voice perfectly controlled, an extraordinary fiction. It is, Poirot agreed pleasantly, an extraordinary truth. You arrived at Vane House Thursday morning before Soames. You spoke to Soames in the 45 minutes before Sir Aldous came downstairs. You showed him the forged will, a document you had prepared over several weeks, practicing the signature, researching the legal format, taking great care. And then you made one mistake. He paused. Roland said nothing, but he was very still now. The stillness not of composure, but of an animal that has heard something in the undergrowth and has not yet decided which direction to run. You signed the will, Poirot said, as Aldous R. Vane. You knew your uncle's middle name was Reginald. You knew this because it was a family fact, the kind of thing one absorbs without particularly attending to it. What you did not know, because you had never had cause to look, was that your uncle never used this initial, not in 40 years of correspondence. Not in legal documents, not in personal letters, not in communication with his bank or his solicitor or the King's Counsel. He signed himself always as Aldous Vane. The R did not exist for him. It was a name on a birth certificate, nothing more. Poirot looked at him steadily. You added it because you thought it would make the signature more formal, more convincing, more like a man signing his last will and testament, rather than a casual letter. He spread his hands. Instead, it was the one thing in the entire construction that did not fit. The one thing that was not him. The fire crackled. A coal shifted and settled. The document examiner confirmed this at 8 o'clock this morning, Poirot said. The signature is a forgery. The pressure patterns are inconsistent. The letter formation is wrong. He paused. And Miss Soames, with whom I spoke this morning at his offices in Holborn, has provided Inspector Crail with a full account of what took place on Thursday. Something changed in Roland's face. It was not dramatic. There was no collapse, no sudden raw emotion, no confession delivered at volume for the benefit of the room. It was quieter than that, and in its quietness more final. The performance simply stopped. The careful constructed face of a man with nothing to hide became, in the space of perhaps 3 seconds, the face of a man with everything to hide and nowhere left to put it. It was, Poirot thought, the most honest Roland Vane had looked since he arrived at Vane House. You cannot prove the digitalis, Roland said. His voice was different now, flatter, stripped of its polish. The post-mortem examination will be ordered this afternoon, Inspector Crail said from his position near the window, speaking for the first time, with specific instruction to test for elevated digitalis levels in the tissue. He paused. Modern toxicology, mister. Vane is rather good at finding things that have been put where they shouldn't be. Roland looked at the inspector, then at Poirot, then at his sister, who was looking at him with an expression that was not anger, exactly, and not grief, exactly, but something that combined elements of both, with a kind of terrible, exhausted recognition, the look of someone who has refused, for a long time, to know something they in some corner of themselves have always known. He was going to ruin me, Roland said. The words came out without preamble, without apology, in the tone of a man stating what he considers a simple fact. He had millions sitting in accounts he barely touched, and I had debts, I had obligations, He stopped. Something moved across his face that might, in another man, have been shame, but in Roland Vane seemed more like frustration, the frustration of someone who has been misunderstood. I was going to pay it back. Once the estate was mine, it would all have been settled. He would never even have known the final total. He knew enough, Poirot said quietly. He was an old man. He was dying. I was his family, his only real family. I spent 20 years. Roland's voice tightened, then released. I spent 20 years being what he needed me to be. Dutiful, present, patient. And he was going to leave it all to a charitable trust. The last two words came out with a bitterness so concentrated it seemed to alter the temperature of the room. After everything, Poirot repeated. He said it without irony, without judgment, simply repeated it, let it hang in the air of the drawing-room of Vane House, in the November light, in the presence of a dead man's furniture and a dead man's portraits and a dead man's housekeeper, standing at the door with her hands very still at her sides. "Roland Vane," Inspector Crale said, moving forward, "I am arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Sir Aldous Vane, and for the offence of fraud in connection with the falsification of a legal document. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say." The rest of it Poirot did not listen to closely. He had heard it before many times, in many rooms. He moved instead to the window and looked out at the garden, the frost-silvered lawn, the bare oak, the stone bench. Behind him he heard Roland being led from the room. He heard Cecily make a single quiet sound, not a sob, more like an exhale, the sound of something held for a long time being finally released. He heard Mrs. Fitch say to no one in particular, in a voice that was very steady, "I'll put the kettle on." Poirot remained in Vane House until evening. He sat for a while in Sir Aldous' chair in the study, not thinking particularly, or rather, allowing his mind to move at its own pace through the case, from the beginning, checking the structure of it, the way a builder walks a completed wall, checking for weakness. He found none, which gave him neither pride nor pleasure, only the quiet satisfaction of a thing done correctly. He looked at the green glass paperweight on the corner of the desk. H.E.V. Helena Evelyn Vane. He reminded him to be careful, Soames had said. In the end the caution had not been enough, but it was the paperweight, in a sense, that had pointed the way. The initials of a woman who had been dead for decades, preserved on a piece of glass, had made him think about initials, about names, about the R that should not have been there. Small things. They were always small things. He picked up the paperweight, held it for a moment, set it down. He found Cecily in the parlour at 5:30, sitting where Mrs. Fitch had sat when he first arrived. The same chair, the same fire, a cup of tea going cold on the same table. She looked up when he came in, and he saw that she had been crying, properly this time, not the quick-drying tears of the drawing-room 2 days ago, but the real thing, slow and spent. "Sit down," she said. He sat. For a while neither of them spoke. The fire burned. The house was quiet around them, a different quiet from the quiet of the previous days, lighter somehow, as if something that had been pressing down on it had been lifted. "I knew," she said at last. Not a confession, exactly, more an admission to herself, made in his presence. Not about the poison, not the details, but I knew Roland was. I knew something was wrong with him. Has been for years. She looked at the fire. He's very good at being what people need to see. He always was, even as a boy. A pause. "I think that's lonelier than it sounds." Poirot considered this. It is possible to feel both sorrow for a person and hold them accountable for what they have done, he said. These are not contradictions. She looked at him. Is that what you do? He thought about it honestly, the way he tried to think about most things. I try, he said. I do not always succeed. I am better at the accountability than sorrow, I think. It is perhaps a professional habit. She almost smiled. At least you know it. Knowing one's limitations, Poirot said, is the beginning of working around them. He paused. What will you do now? I don't know. She wrapped her hands around the cold teacup. The house will go to the trust, presumably. Which is what Uncle Aldous wanted. She was quiet for a moment. I think I'll be all right with that. I think I always would have been. She looked up. It was Roland who couldn't bear it. Who couldn't bear the idea that 20 years of performance hadn't purchased anything permanent. Greed, Poirot said, is rarely only about money. In my experience, it is more often about the fear that one has not been sufficiently valued, that the world has not paid what it owes. He paused. This does not excuse it. But it explains, perhaps, how an otherwise intelligent man arrives at decisions of extraordinary stupidity. Cecily was quiet for a moment. Then, did you always know it was him? Poirot considered the question with the honesty it deserved. I suspected Roland from very early, he said. But I was not certain until the envelope. And I was not ready to act until I had spoken to Soames this morning. He paused. I will tell you this because you have been honest with me. I made an error on Friday. I suggested to Inspector Crail that Dr. Crane warranted investigation. I was wrong. I had assembled the available facts into the nearest available shape rather than the correct one. I corrected it, but not without having first been incorrect. He looked at her steadily. I mention this not because it is important to the outcome, but because I think it is important to say. Certainty is a dangerous state. It is better to be correct after doubt than confident without justification. She looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read. You're quite an unusual man, Monsieur Poirot. So I have been told, he said, without displeasure. On many occasions. He left Vane House at 7 o'clock. Mrs. Fitch stood at the door and shook his hand. Both hands, briefly, the way people do when a handshake is not quite sufficient. She did not say much. She did not need to. 22 years of loyalty to a difficult man, who had valued her without ever quite saying so, and a letter written in desperation to a small Belgian detective she had only read about in a magazine. It had been enough. Just enough. Poirot walked down the gravel path between the overgrown box hedges, through the iron gate with its groaning hinge, and out onto Vane Lane. The evening was clear and very cold, the sky above the rooftops a deep, darkening blue. His breath made small clouds in the air before him. He stood for a moment on the pavement, not quite ready to raise his hand for a taxicab, letting the cold settle around him. He thought about Sir Aldous Vane, a man he had never met, a man who had died believing he was about to right a wrong, who had called a solicitor in the morning and been dead by evening. The letter that might have saved him already missing from the house, the brandy already doing its slow, invisible work. A difficult man, a solitary man. A man who had kept a dead woman's paperweight on his desk for 40 years as a reminder to be careful. He had not been careful enough in the end. But then, Poirot reflected, neither are most of us, when the person we fail to be careful about is someone we know. He raised his hand. A taxicab slowed and stopped. He got in, gave his address in Chelsea, and settled back against the seat. As the cab pulled away from Vane Lane, he allowed himself one last look at the house. Dark now, the windows blank, the iron gate standing open as he had left it. Vane House. Still forbidding, even emptied of its secret. Some houses kept their atmosphere long after the thing that created it had been removed. He turned away. The little gray cells, he thought, deserved their rest. They had, on this occasion, earned it.